Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining this event presented by American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society in Boston. I'm Margaret Talcott, the producer of our American Inspiration Author Series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us today in the land of history, looking again at the Civil War. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event featuring author Brian Matthew Jordan and his new book, A Thousand May Fall. More on Professor Jordan in a moment, but for now, some quick housekeeping items. We are in a Zoom webinar format, which means that your microphone is muted and your video is off. We cannot take your comments in the chat, but you can look there for links related to our discussion. This evening, we're lucky to have Professor Jordan. He'll do a full presentation for us. It's really excellent. He'll speak for 30 to 35 minutes, then we'll launch into a Q&A. We asked for your questions as you registered. We got a great number of those. Thank you. They came from all over the country. If you have additional queries, please enter them into the Q&A button, and we'll see what we can slip in. Tonight's program is being recorded by my colleagues here at the Brew Family Learning Center. The video will be published on our website in the days ahead. We are going to Zoom email you when it's posted and freely accessible on the American Inspiration Archive. I also want to remind you that, of course, the real pleasure of this evening comes from reading Professor Jordan's book with extensive footnotes, a treasure trove of Civil War resources. Copies of A Thousand May Fall can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Mass. You'll see on the screen their coupon code AMINS20, which is also being placed in the chat. If you use that code as you order online, you'll receive a signed book-plated copy. On the bookstore's website, you'll find you have an option of a hardcover copy or a paperback edition, which is just now being published, available after January 25. Now, moving quickly to start, I want to give you some background on our guest author. Brian Matthew Jordan is an associate professor of history at Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, Texas. His first book, Marching Home: Union Veterans and Their Upending Civil War, was a finalist, one of 3 runners-up in the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for History. In its dissertation form, the work won the George Washington Eggleston Prize for Best U.S. History dissertation at Yale University, where he earned his PhD. It also won the John Addison Porter Prize, one of Yale's highest honors. Brian studied as an undergraduate at Gettysburg College. He's published more than 100 articles, reviews, and essays in the Journal of the Civil War, Civil War History, and the New York Times. He serves as the book editor for the Civil War Monitor and is a member of the Society of Civil War Historians. Though he's now a Texan, Brian is a native of Akron, Ohio. Brian, we are so thrilled that you're here and that you're going to start us off. We are really quite cold here in Boston, and here you are coming to us from Huntsville. From your office, is that where you are?
That is right. It's about 50 degrees here, though, which is a cold winter's night in Houston.
Oh my God. Well, we all have frost on our windows. So you're going to have to, we're very happy to be returning to your roots in Ohio and to this remarkable regiment who certainly got their share of the cold. Their experience of the Civil War, as your book says, was like so many others. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Over to you, sir, for more.
Well, thank you so very much, Margaret, for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully you can all see that. I'm most grateful to have the opportunity to talk with you this evening about my most recent book, A Thousand May Fall. At the heart of this book are the men of the 107th Ohio Volunteer Infantry Regiment, an ethnically German unit mustered from a dozen northeastern Ohio counties during the dark days of the Civil War's second summer. Very nearly 70% of the men on its muster rolls were ethnically German or foreign-born. While immigrant soldiers, of course, were hardly unknown in Lincoln's armies, more than 200,000 ethnic Germans would don United States blue between 1861 and 1865. Units in which foreign soldiers outnumbered native-born men were especially rare. The 107th was one of only 30 ethnic regiments among the more than 3,500 military organizations that comprised the Union armies. But though language and identity set them apart, the men of the 107th Ohio still weathered, of course, the numbing human ordeal of war in ordinary ways. They were men betwixt and between, men who belonged but did not. They whipsawed between heroism and heartbreak, duty and dereliction, cynicism and conviction. They endured the war's extremes, shivering in squalls of snow at Brooks Station in Virginia and flagging under the fevers of Folly Island in South Carolina. They swatted at gluttonous mosquitoes in camp and navigated treacherous roads on the march. They battled treasonous rebels at the front and then exchanged taunts with contemptuous civilians back home, resisting with equal vigor both Republican radicalism and Democratic defeatism. They knew the taste of victory, participating alongside the famous 54th Massachusetts Regiment in a rail-twisting raid into the heart of the Palmetto State. But more often, they felt the ache of defeat. Indeed, the 107th lost half of its strength at the Battle of Chancellorsville, and then 2 months later, half of those survivors were lost at Gettysburg. When they returned north, they tended to the onerous errands of memory and to the many agonies of chronically sick, wounded, and disabled men. Still, they took pride in their pain, insisted that they somehow maintained a monopoly on misfortune. They claimed an authority over the war that derived directly from their suffering. Hard luck and treachery, both real and imagined, sharpened the unit's understanding of the war. These are not the kinds of Civil War soldiers that most Americans have known. Reassuring histories have exaggerated Billy Yank's courage, pluck, and determination, while another body of scholarship has worked to foreground the Union soldiers' anguish, misery, and woe. Both views have revealed a lot about Civil War soldiers, but they've equally effaced, I think, the war's complexities, positing narratives of progress or declension that ultimately fail to capture the murk and muck of life in camp and on the march, the urgent human demands of carrying on, standing guard, putting one foot in front of the other, the satisfaction of having suffered, sacrificed, and yet somehow survived. By recovering how a community of men navigated the many mercurial demands of war, regimental histories are ideal vessels for rendering a more complete, a more capacious, and ultimately a more inclusive narrative of our nation's deadliest conflict. One that maps the liminal space between ennobling narratives and lived realities. Regimentals can retrieve something of how the war was actually felt, intuited, and experienced in real time. Now, modern readers will doubtless regard A Thousand May Fall as a contribution to the so-called new military history, because it moves us beyond questions of tactics and strategy to probe the larger culture and society that shaped and informed the fighting in the first place. But perhaps more accurately, the book actually revives a very old kind of military history. The regimental was really the first genre of writing about the Civil War. Hoping to preserve their experiences, hundreds of veterans took up their pens and produced unit histories in the decades after Appomattox. Among these veteran authors was Jacob Smith, an ambulance wagon driver in the 107th Ohio, who hoped tellingly as late as 1910 that something of the toils and danger and labor and hardships of soldiers in the Civil War might finally wind its way into print. Regimentals were carefully considered, amply documented, finely grained, often very painstaking histories of how the Civil War annexed ordinary lives and communities. They stood in sharp contrast to more popular accounts that looked back nostalgically on the war. Evoking the spirit of these early unit histories, then, A Thousand May Fall rummages around snowy winter camps. It trundles along dusty roads and prowls along distant picket lines to reveal how real people negotiated the war and its long aftermath. Its pages teem with men who sometimes faltered, often struggled to maintain hope, and not infrequently wondered whether the war was worth it after all. By centering such men in the narrative frame, we can begin to map something of the Civil War's human topography. A retelling of the 107th Service develops at least three arguments. First, the war's spaces, places, and environments shaped soldiers' attitudes toward the war and informed their emerging understanding of the conflict. Tramping across starkly militarized landscapes awakened men to the war's earnest realities, while zagging along miles of trenches and through makeshift forts impressed upon them something of the war's enormous scale. As they swung picks and spades and muscled logs onto corduroy roads, they acquired a new, more capacious understanding of the war's scope and complexity. Equipped with this new understanding, they measured the physical and metaphorical distance between the home front and the battlefield. Secondly, and not unrelatedly, experiences between the battles and behind the lines did as much, if not more, to inform regimental identity. Though we often recount the war as an unbroken sequence of battles and military campaigns, the war from the soldier's perspective, of course, amounted to long stretches of strategic inactivity and numbing picket duties, punctuated by only the most occasional rendezvous with the enemy, engagements that themselves remained shrouded in the proverbial fog of war. Indeed, Civil War soldiers spent much more time in camp and on the march than they did in battle. And it should follow that these experiences proved absolutely crucial to their morale, to their motivation, and to their sense of unit pride and identity. Finally, the war continued to annex the lives of survivors and their families who grappled to escape the conflict's shadow. Even those who returned to lead meaningful and civically engaged lives suffered quietly with the legacies of the conflict. Ugly wounds prevented Frank Rothermel from opening his mouth more than a third of an inch, Theobald Hasman from raising his hands above his head, Peter Scheib from extending his arm. A shell wound not only deafened Lance and McKinney, but left his face badly disfigured. The war was something indelibly inscribed on their bodies, something they were never able again to escape. The loss of pre-war trades and independence and mobility afflicted still others in a society where one's capacity for manual labor proved a marker of manhood. More than a few of this regiment's veterans ended their days in the wards of state insane asylums and county poor hospitals. In short, the war went on. For the men of the 107th Ohio, that war began at Camp Cleveland, a sprawling training complex sited on about 50 acres immediately south of that city on September the 9th, 1862. The unit's enlistment motivations defy any sort of neat categorization. Some saw in the Secession War a continuation of the failed democratic revolutions of 1848. Others saw an opportunity to fight Smith-Siegel and strike at slavery. In defiance of their elders, a dozen young men stole away from Zoar, Ohio, a communitarian society on the Tuscarawas River, persuaded that pacifism was no longer practical in the face of a slaveholding rebellion. For others, pecuniary inducements appealed more powerfully than patriotism. Whatever their motivation, some 994 men answered the regiment's first roll call. With fewer than 3 weeks of training under their belt plates and shoddy Austrian muskets on their shoulders, the 107th Ohio set out on its first assignment. Earlier that summer of 1862, a rebel raid had looped to within 60 miles of Cincinnati. And though the immediate threat had passed, Ohio's governor ordered his newest recruits into the earthen works that coiled around Covington, Kentucky, in an effort to reassure the Queen City's yet uneasy denizens of their security. If the care with which 21-year-old John Brunny described it as any indication, the regiment's first march in Kentucky proved a formative episode. At first, things moved forward, accompanied by song, Brunny explained. Then the temperatures rose and the haversacks grew heavy. The muscles became sore, thirst set in. Cursing officers struggled to keep men in the ranks as they lost courage and collapsed along the side of the road. Their first march invited them to reconsider their naive optimism about the war, to distinguish between cowardice and straggling. Further, when it was revealed that the unit had spent an entire day marching in circles, that their intended destination could have been reached in but an hour, the men were forced to question openly both the perspicacity of their leaders and some of the more rank absurdities of war. Still more taxing marches awaited the men once they were transferred to the seat of the conflict in Virginia that autumn. Roads caked in a thick porridge-like muck arrested the Army's progress, supplying an uncomfortably apt metaphor for the conflict. Aimless bustle invited skepticism, or in the case of Burnside's mud march, in which artillery chests and limber wagons were literally swallowed up to their axles in thick mud, humiliation. The Buckeyes settled in for a long winter north of the Rappahannock River, shivering in squalls of snow as waves of dysentery and diarrhea and typhoid made deadly romps through the ranks. The winter of 1862 to 63 proved didactic. Operational historians have long recognized that the months the Army of the Potomac spent moored on the Rappahannock River amounted to a strategic pause, a prized period for troops to rest and regroup. But less fully appreciated is the extent to which that encampment invited sustained reflection among the enlisted men, both about their participation in the war and the peace movement that was then rapidly gaining adherents on the northern home front. Indeed, the winter encampment of 62-63 coincided neatly with the ascendancy of the anti-war Copperhead Democrats, whose leading exponent, an Ohio congressman named Clement Vallandigham, would deliver an anti-war tirade on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, the very day the 107th Ohio trudged toward its campsite at Brook Station. Throughout the North, many Republicans decried Democratic defeatism. Nowhere did the opposition to Copperheadism blaze with more righteous fury than in the camps of the 107th Ohio. From their winter huts, the men ratified resolutions expressing their desire to see the war prosecuted through to a vigorous end. If they don't want us to come down here and fight, one of the unit's enlisted men recommended, why, let them keep their mouths shut and not disturb us. I will leave my bones to bleach on the battlefields of the sunny South, he retorted, before I will say compromise or enough. Idealizing their shivering, their suffering, and their sacrifices, the men of the regiment invited a contrast between their own martial masculinity and the unmanly agitation of the stay-at-homes. Some of the men even expressed a desire to engage with the Copperheads in open combat. In an intrepid editorial, one private proposed to send some of our weather-beaten soldiers home, armed with a gun and a bayonet and 60 rounds of cartridges. Halfway business is about played out, Christian Schreiner explained. It would indeed be a deplorable thing if civil war should break out in the North. But if it cannot be avoided in any other way than by yielding to the Copperheads and the Mudsill rebels, then I say let it come. The coincidence of anti-war opposition on the northern home front with these months of restless immobility at the front helped to clarify what was at stake in the war, promoting an ironic sort of unity within the politically fractious Army of the Potomac. The more the Copperheads rave, Schreiner resolved, the more determined the men in this army get. There is an army pride growing up, even now in full existence, that will make it irresistible, explained one enlisted man brigaded with the 107th. And what is very important, that pride will place this army entirely beyond the influence of Copperheadism at home. Well, that renewed strength and unity would be sharply tested. The Army of the Potomac finally got its chance to engage Robert E. Lee's men at Chancellorsville, the first 3 days of May 1863. For its part, the 107th Ohio shook out into a line of battle at the Tally Farm along the Orange Plank Road, holding the extreme right of the 11th Corps, which in turn held the extreme right of the Union Army. Throughout the morning of May the 2nd, 1863, reports about an ominous buildup of enemy troops on that flank proliferated at Union headquarters. Even so, nothing perhaps could have prepared the men for the staggering force of the blow that would be delivered just after 5 o'clock by Stonewall Jackson's troops. Jackson's 26,000 whiskey-baited rebels had stolen through the tangled scrub of a second-growth Virginia forest on a dozen-mile march that would deliver them to the exposed end of the Union line, a Union line left dangling in the air. It was pandemonium. The bullets, Christian Riker from the 107th marveled, the bullets just whistled by my head like a real hailstorm. The men squeezed their triggers and stood as long as a stand could be made, one insisted, before falling back in full retreat. If we'd remained just 5 minutes longer, the Ohioans' lieutenant colonel insisted, we all should have been killed or taken prisoners. As it was, the regiment's baptism of fire had inflicted staggering losses. The rebels had killed, wounded, or bagged as Richmond-bound prisoners some 220 men. Even the regimental surgeon, the old 48er Charles Hartman, was killed, a fate that would have deleterious consequences for ailing veterans pursuing their pension claims after the war. Chancellorsville also visited great psychological damage upon the unit. Almost immediately after the battle, Godfrey Capel of Company I began to manifest symptoms of what some in the unit would call nervous fever, a malady that quickly became an epidemic. An infirmity with the tantalizing name nervous deafness placed at least one soldier from Company G on the sick rolls. Citing his feeble state of health and the perilous condition of his company, as well as the recent trials and hardships to which the unit had been subjected in the late battles of Chancellorsville, Hamilton Starkweather resigned his first lieutenant's commission on the spot. Indeed, it seemed to many as though the world had stopped the moment those long lines of rebels emerged from the woods to slap that Union flank. Frantic minds lurched between scenes hastily recorded and half remembered, the rush of events mocking any sense of chronology or scale. Men routinely confessed their inability to translate memories of the battle into lucid or linear prose. If I were to write it at all, Riker explained to his sister, I would need almost a week in which to write. One regimental surgeon in the 107th Brigade apologized for the scattershot quality of his letters home. I've had so much on my mind, he explained, that I could hardly direct my thoughts from pressing matters of business long enough to write a connected epistle. For one volunteer, the battle endured in memory, not as an event with a discrete chronology, but rather as a jarring soundscape, a fiendish yell, a crackling hell of musketry, the bellowing of mules, the agonizing shrieks of wounded horses. The events of that afternoon rushed along at a furious, even dizzying pace. There's no such thing as time on a battlefield, the enlisted man gasped. Though the collapse of the 11th Corps line in no way preordained the Federal Army's crushing defeat at Chancellorsville, Northern newspapers would effortlessly seize upon the so-called stampede of these ethnically German outfits as the devastating battle's decisive moment, cleverly effacing the failure of native-born leadership that had provoked the crisis in the first place. Threats and treaties and orders of commanders were of no avail, the daily national intelligencer seethed from Washington, D.C. Thousands of these cowards threw down their guns and soon streamed down the road toward headquarters. For weeks, false-hearted allegations, dripping with an ugly nativism, annexed Northern newspaper columns. Only months then, after indicting the Copperheads for their own cowardice, the 107th Ohio found itself in the surreal position of responding to allegations of cowardly conduct heaped upon their own. In answering these charges, the men further clarified and organized their ideas about courage, about manhood, about the nature of commitment in war. I saw a letter yesterday from home, Lieutenant John Winkler explained, stating a report that our company left the battlefield and ran at the appearance of the rebels without firing a shot. In a tart letter addressed to the editor of the Worcester Republican, his hometown newspaper, the soldier explained that it was his duty to inform our friends at home of the facts. We went forth to do battle for the Union and the Constitution, he explained, and we want to be used decently and not abused. The men cataloged the battle's human destruction, wielding their lengthy casualty registers as evidence of a brief yet hopeless stand. The memory of noble men gone to their graves, now languishing in hospitals, another correspondent from the 107th added, is entitled to this plain, unvarnished statement of fact. For the ethnic soldiers of the 11th Corps, the struggle to establish what happened along the Orange Turnpike would be nearly as trying and exhausting as the battle itself. But in this fight, they would enlist the broader support of the larger German-American community. From Lower Manhattan to Cleveland to Milwaukee, mass meetings assembled to rebuke the calumniators. At the Cooper Institute in New York, Friedrich Kopp, an ethnically German refugee who had penned several stirring accounts of Hessian contributions during the American Revolution, leveraged his authority as a historian to denounce the defamation of the 11th Corps as altogether dangerous to the Union cause. I never knew a soldier, he explained, who was willing to fight the enemy in the front when his comrades stood ready to stab him from behind. The 107th Ohio had scarcely taken inventory of the tragedy that had befallen them on the Orange Turnpike when, just 2 months later, they once more found themselves in the throes of the killing. In the wake of his tactical masterpiece at Chancellorsville, Robert E. Lee grew hubristic, impatient to resume the offensive. He drew his army of Northern Virginia into Pennsylvania. As the Army of the Potomac felt its way north to check the enemy's invasion, doubts and anxieties began to crowd out whatever confidence the soldiers had been able to regain in recent weeks. In camp near Emmitsburg, Maryland, on the evening of June the 30th, 1863, intuiting that another engagement was imminent, a soldier who had resisted Jackson's flank attack alongside the 107th slipped into a mournful trance. I stood leaning against a camp stake, with mind reverting to Chancellorsville, filled with anticipations of a second edition. In this sad reverie, the veteran was amid the carnage once more, surrounded by gleaming bayonets and staggering wounded, tormented by the piercing cries of mangled combatants. He was prophetic. For the next morning, a meeting engagement metamorphosed into the war's bloodiest battle. At the double quick, the 107th tore through Gettysburg, now a perfect picture of Bedlam, the northern fringes of the borough, where they were stacked on the campus of the county almshouse. They'd no more caught their collective breath when an intrepid young division commander, 28-year-old Francis Channing Barlow, beckoned them to brace a beleaguered federal brigade planted atop Blocker's Knoll. Atop that rise, the Ohioans held the tip of a sharp salient at very long odds. Before long, the federal line collapsed under the converging fire of swarming Georgians. The Ohioans instinctively abandoned the deadly perch to which they never should have advanced, offering whatever resistance they could as they scrambled to the rear. Back at the almshouse, the 107th Ohio's adjutant gripped the regimental colors in a daring attempt to rally the dazed remnants of the unit. The retreat was harrowing, but it was especially so for the unit's ambulance detail, obliged to wind wagons heaping with wounded and injured men through the confused, gnarled masses congesting the borough's streets. We were not long in finding sufficient wounded soldiers to fill our wagons, Jacob Smith recalled in wry understatement. His gruesome cargo testified to the intensity of the fight atop the knoll. One soldier had been shot through the mouth, the musket ball entering through one of his cheeks and exiting out the other, ejecting in the process 4 or 5 teeth and severing his tongue pretty near off. For the second time in as many battles, for the second time in as many months, the 107th Ohio had been thrashed. Of the 458 men who entered the fight that morning, no more than 171 limped to the unit's new position behind a low stone fence atop East Cemetery Hill. There, another bloody fight awaited, a twilight action which swirled desperately around well-poised federal batteries. The Ohioans and their threadbare brigade repulsed the Louisiana Tigers, secured the anchor of the Union fishhook line, and set up the cataclysmic battle's final day. Save the occasional crack of a rebel sharpshooter's rifle, the 107th did not come under fire that third and final day at Gettysburg. They instead listened with nervous anxiety as a rebel cannonade yielded to the distant rattle of musketry, and then to another restless night under arms, and finally to an orchestra of human misery. Shrill cries and heartrending groans, the only serenade on this 4th of July. After Gettysburg, in a move that seemingly confirmed the pejorative assessments of its ethnic soldiers, Army headquarters yielded to popular sentiments, to popular demand, and abolished the ill-fated 11th Corps. In August of 1863, the 107th was whisked to the war's margins, made to pass its last 21 months, marking time and conducting garrison duties in swampy South Carolina and Florida. Moored in exotic camps far from home, subjected to mindless drill and monotonous fatigue duties, the men betrayed their dejection and gloom in letters and diaries. We looked every hour upon the same naked beaches of sand, one enlisted man explained, the same drooping palmettos. Unable to escape the thought that they had been consigned to irrelevance, they no longer shined their shoes or folded their gum blankets or polished their muskets. Deprived of the opportunity to battle the rebels in a stand-up fight, they instead chronicled their campaigns against sand fleas and scorpions, wood ticks and mosquitoes. Most just wanted the war to be over. Though several companies dutifully marked their ballots for President Lincoln in the fall election in 1864, a plurality actually cast their ballots for his Democratic opponent, George McClellan, believing that he was likelier than old Abe to end the war. They were the only Ohio unit to deliver a victory to Lincoln's Democratic opponent. "It is strange," remarked one patronizing Connecticut soldier who had fought alongside the Ohioans at Gettysburg, "that men who endured so many hardships should be so blind and ignorant as to support that which is working to destroy all the good they ever accomplished." On the mossy islands of South Carolina, as for the rest of their lives, the men shouldered the burden, the stigma of Chancellorsville. After the war, the regiment survivors lamented nothing more than having to hear frequently slurs thrown even by men who called themselves our comrades. Segregation from the larger community of Union veterans reinforced the regiment's conviction that it was uniquely unfortunate. So too did the cynicism of prying pension examiners who looked skeptically upon claims for exposure to the elements and the effects of tropical climes. In their pension applications, made all the more difficult by the nature of their service, the veterans rehearsed their story as a pageantry of woe. Neither convinced that they had climbed the snowy heights of honor, nor entirely ready to concede that the war was some irredeemable folly, the men of the regiment instead fused pain and pride into a singular interpretation of the war. Loss and anguish were, for even the most sentimental among the veterans, fundamental to the conflict's meaning. Tainted with the stigma of cowardice, the 107th Ohio instead drew attention to its terrible record of slaughter, eager to attest that it had battled no less manfully than native-born soldiers. But because 20th century narratives of the Civil War had such little patience for agony and misgiving, they had no room for these or most other ethnic soldiers. Narratives of loyalty and suffering proved no match for tales stained by nativism and sentimentality. The Civil War instead became urgently our war, a brother's quarrel, not a human contest waged in part by immigrant soldiers. Today, the men of the 107th Ohio are hardly known, even in the counties and communities that sent them off to war. Copies of the original regimental history produced by ambulance wagon driver Smith remain scarce, tattered heirlooms long forgotten. I have never in thought or word regretted what little I had done for my country in the way of duty, Smith wrote in the conclusion to that tome, published in 1910. But I've always been proud that I'd taken some humble part in the great strife. Confident but self-conscious, acknowledging the yawning void between the war he waged and the war his adopted nation preferred to imagine. The old soldier, I think, had penned a most fitting epitaph for his regiment. Thank you so very much for your kind attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Brian, I'll be right with you. Here I am. That was a wonderful presentation. And you're a marvelous presenter, and thank you so much. I learned an enormous amount reading the book, but hearing you talk about it is even better. So thank you for that. I am merely a vehicle for the audience questions here, and we have so many good ones. So let me start right in. First off, how did you go? Well, I'll ask you, how did you go about researching the 107th, but why don't you start with why? Why don't we start with why? Why did you choose to write about the 107th Ohio?
Well, it's a great question. About 10 years ago, I was asked to prepare an essay on the only federal colonel who was court-martialed for cowardice as a result of the Battle of Gettysburg. And that colonel was Colonel Seraphim Meyer, the leader of the 107th. I went through his court-martial records at the National Archives and became absolutely fascinated by his story. His son was the captain of Company C in the 107th, and there's this great family drama that plays out. And I prepared the essay and then kept coming back to the men of this unit, kept bumping into them in the course of other projects. the unit was raised in my native northeastern Ohio, so I knew a lot of the towns and communities and counties that nodded them off to war. And so that was an opportunity for me to kind of return home in many ways. And I also historiographically came at this project at a moment when a lot of my colleagues who write Civil War history have begun embracing the regimental history as a vehicle for amplifying voices that have been historically marginalized, the voices of ordinary soldiers, of ethnic soldiers, of less than heroic units. And so I think I really became enamored with this idea that you could, through the lens of a particular community of men, and the extended community of their families, tell a different and ultimately human story of the Civil War.
Which leads us to how your sources in the back of the book are amazing. A real treasure trove of various places and people and research organizations and historical societies. But tell us a little bit more about how you went about researching. I mean, if someone wanted to research a regimental history, where would you begin? And what of the many sources you used proved most beneficial to you?
So I think there are two absolutely indispensable sources for regimental histories. One is to turn to local civilian newspapers. Local newspapers in the Civil War era often couldn't afford war correspondents to go off to the front to send them the news of the war to print. And so the newspaper editors would rely on local soldiers writing letters back home, either directly to the editor or to their families, and they would print often verbatim these soldier letters in the columns of the newspapers as their way to report the news of the war. So there's a great trove of really yet untapped soldier letters in local newspapers. Civil War historians have used them with greater frequency in recent years, but there's still a lot of letters that haven't seen the light of day in local papers. The other indispensable source is to go to the National Archives and to mine the regimental order books. Every unit was required to maintain records of their camp life, of the hospital rolls, enlistment records, disciplinary actions. For the 107th, there are these 8 oversized, leather-bound, brittle volumes that just document in exhaustive detail and give you kind of an unfiltered view of what was going on in the unit. So those two were absolutely indispensable, in particular for this unit, because in the traditional archives and libraries where we like to work as Civil War historians, there are only a handful of letters from 107th Ohio soldiers. So this was really a project of recovery in many ways, work of historical detective work in which you had to piece together this story from the newspapers, from the regimental order books, and also from records left behind by units that fought alongside or maybe witnessed perhaps something similar, or were present at a camp at a particular moment. And I could use those accounts from neighboring soldiers to kind of peer into the world of the 107th.
You've answered many questions with that answer, but one of them specifically we want to understand what other regiment of Germans were from Ohio. There were several of them, and you do make reference, just as you said, to many regiments side by side who were reporting on each other. But tell us a little bit about the other Ohioan regiments of Germans.
Sure. So as I mentioned, there were 30 ethnic regiments in the Union Army, and there are 6 ethnic regiments from Ohio. The 107th was the 5th of the half dozen ethnically German regiments mustered from the Buckeye State. These were the brainchild of Ohio's War Democratic Governor David Todd, who was smartly seeking a way to satisfy Ohio's enlistment quotas and wanted to tap into that rich vein of very recent ethnic German immigration that poured into the state in the 1850s. There are a lot of German outfits from Ohio that were mustered from the Cincinnati area. Perhaps the most famous is the Fighting Ninth Ohio. But you also have the 107th, of course, and the 106th Ohio as well as other German outfits, and certainly Wisconsin and Illinois, other Midwestern states would supply still more.
You referenced this earlier, but another question, since so many left Germany to get away from the constant wars, what prompted them to fight this war? You mentioned the continuation of 1848, and tell us a little more about their motives in joining up.
Absolutely. This unit is really unique because you have kind of zealous anti-slavery Republicans, but also dyed-in-the-wool Democrats. It's, we often kind of think about German immigrants in the Civil War era as Republicans, I think because of the influence of political figures like Carl Schurz and others. But it's important to remember that a lot of these German immigrants were kind of keeping arm's length from the Republican Party because they saw the Republican Party as too close to the nativist know-nothing movement. They thought the Republican Party had been too welcoming to old know-nothing party members into that anti-slavery coalition. So you have a lot of Republicans and Democrats. Not all of these folks are fighting an abolition war. Many of them are fighting a union war, and they see the slaveholders' rebellion as really an aristocratic movement, as an anti-democratic movement, as something that will destroy the last best hope of earth, the last great bastion of democracy, which of course in mid-19th century is on the run. And so this is a continuation of that failed effort. They have the opportunity, of course, to fight under many of the very same commanders. Franz Sigel, a revolutionary emigre, goes on to a pretty checkered Civil War record, but nonetheless, he had a peerless reputation among German immigrants. And so this is a continuation of the war. It's a war for union, it's a war for self-government, it's a war for democracy, and it's a war against the slaveholding aristocracy.
Another question here. My great-great-grandfather was injured at Spotsylvania Courthouse and released from the hospital a year later, living as a cripple until 1920 on a meager stipend. Was this typical?
Regrettably so. Regrettably more typical than I wish I could report. In my previous book, Marching Home, I kind of get at these struggles and the extent of these struggles. Of course, Civil War veterans returned to a civilian society that wanted to move quickly beyond the painful issues of the war. There was no Veterans Administration. There was only a nascent pension bureau, and these pensions were paltry in many cases. A missing arm or a missing leg netted you $8 per month at a time when the average carpenter was making $30 per month. And so it was often a great struggle. Of course, many of these injuries often meant the loss of a pre-war trade or economic independence. And we have not yet done a great job thinking about and taking inventory of the extent of suffering, physical, emotional, mental trauma unleashed by the war. And certainly 19th century Americans didn't have either the patience or the ideology or the diagnostic language to really wrestle with those problems, which they were more apt to attribute to individual character flaws rather than the traumas of war.
Heartbreaking. Questions come in over the Q&A about the title of the book, A Thousand May Fall, which is, of course, a literary reference. But tell us more about that.
Yes, so this comes from a letter that was penned by Christian Riker, who joined up from that pacifist communitarian society, Zor, Ohio. He quoted Psalm 91, a thousand may fall in the wake of the Battle of Chancellorsville. And I thought it was a very literary and evocative way to kind of get at the community of a regiment and to highlight right? The extremes and the traumas and the human topography of the regiment.
So more of a religious reference. My
Yes.
apologies. A question in the Q&A. When did most of the German-born soldiers of the 107th emigrate? Were most of them from the same region? Was German still a preferred language for them?
Yes, German was still a preferred language, and these were bilingual units, right? They would, and they produced German language newspapers and wrote letters in German back home. The immigrants came over, really most of them in the early 1850s. It was that wave of immigration immediately after the 1848. So they'd planted some roots in northeastern Ohio. They had begun life anew when the Civil War erupts. And that, of course, plays for many of them into their enlistment motivation, right? They see this rebellion as spoiling, right, this new opportunity that they have here in the Midwest. They come from all regions of Germany. There's again, that kind of defies easy categorization, but most of them were in the early 1850s coming over to Ohio. And many were very active in the Turner clubs and the Turner movement, and that supplied quite a number of these soldiers as well.
You and I took a quick look at all these questions, and you and I both liked this question. I'm interested in the role of fife players. Is there a way to research this topic in the Civil War?
Yeah, I love that question.
Germany. Are they from Germany, fife players?
I love the question, and it's historiographically very timely because we're just now getting some good work on the soundscapes of the Civil War. Incidentally, one of the main characters, one of the protagonists of A Thousand May Fall, is John Brunny, who was a regimental musician. He was a bugler, and he left some of the rare letters that are yet preserved in archives relating to this unit. But the role of regimental bands and the role of music in forming and shaping community between and among soldiers in the Civil War, I think, has been grossly understudied. But there's some recent scholarship. I would point the questioner to a recent book by James Davis called Music Along the Rapidan, which looks at these regimental bands and the roles that they played and tries to tally all of these fifers and drummers. James Davis is really the great student of the musicology of the Civil War. I'd also recommend Christian McWhirter's book, Battle Hymns, on the role of song during the Civil War. But a great question.
Thank you for that answer. We'll try to collect some of those books' names and get them out to you in the audience. Someone has been looking into your background and your research that you're doing right now, and they are asking the question, what did you learn or further, or how did you further your thinking about memory and history? I understand you're focused on the role of memory in reporting history. Tell us more.
So I am very interested in the cultural legacy of the war. I'm interested in the gap between the reality of events and how they're later recalled or not recalled. I think memory can be a very powerful tool for historical analysis. What I'm interested in, though, is how Civil War soldiers themselves were not only the first custodians of the war's memory, folks who lived it, but then tried to actively shape the story, but then themselves were affected by the stories that the nation preferred to tell itself about the Civil War. Veterans who returned home, right, and the 107th is a great example of this. Their war did not make it into the books, right, with apologies to Walt Whitman there. The real war did not make it into the books for these soldiers. They had to live within a preferred narrative. And that was often as trying as the trauma of battle itself. I think it's terribly important. They never wanted, the veterans of the war never wanted to cede their authority, their custodianship over the war to a public that wanted to sentimentalize, that wanted to segregate the story of the war. And so I'm interested in how memory can have lived social consequences for veterans. And I think that that's something even to this day, as we're still a nation, of course, in an age that we so churlishly call the post-war, telling stories about what it means to be a nation at war. We need to think more carefully about how those stories and how those narratives shape the men who fought it, whose experiences may not align neatly with those tales.
I think that's a wonderful place to pause. And I've learned so much, Brian. Thank you. I'm sure all of our audience has a really fascinating discussion. As we do for all our American Inspiration events, we've asked our guest author tonight to share a reading from his book, and Brian has picked out a great passage. So back to you for that.
More than a century and a half later, genealogists are the most dutiful custodians of the regiment's history, sharing an urgent need to make sense of the great loss and tragedy that befell their forebears. Jim Finkenbinner conducted research on his grandfather, requesting copies of his pension records after touring the Chancellorsville battlefield in the late 1980s. Philip Chirag's great-grandson, a longtime high school history teacher in Massillon, traveled to Germany in search of his ancestor. The Germans were not real popular, he observed. They were kind of like a sacrificial lamb. Chris Nelson, the great-great-grandson of John Flory, wrote an 8-page narrative history of the regiment, until this book, the only modern history of the 107th Ohio. More recently still, Andrew Schur, a direct descendant of Lieutenant Fernando Schur and a lifelong history buff, self-published The Flying Dutchman, a novel of love, separation, friendship, and tragedy based on the unit's experiences. The book's imaginative scenes draw on years of original research, as well as the author's correspondence with descendants of Augustus Vignos and George Billow, who still live in northeastern Ohio. The bonds of regimental comradeship, it seems, are powerful enough to persist across several generations. It is impossible to look back at our ancestors and not feel awe, Schur explained, as well as thankfulness that we never had to endure such severe hardships and mortality. And so the men of the 107th Ohio endure still, urgent voices telling stories about who we are, how our country was saved, and what it means to go to war.
Thank you, Brian. That is so meaningful, especially for those of us who love family history and for the children of immigrants, which describes so many of us, most of us across America. Thank you again for your insight and for your time this evening. Really a pleasure. Just a reminder for those of you out there, copies of 1,000 May Fall can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Mass. There were many, many questions we couldn't get to tonight, and the book has the answers. Use the code AMINS20 as you order online, and you'll receive a signed book-plated copy of the book, either in hardcover or in paperback. It's just out but not available till the 25th. So something to look forward to. We at American Ancestors NEHGS are delighted to have presented tonight's talk. If you're researching a person, a time in history, or a military regiment, you may find our library and education center useful. The stacks on Newbury Street have limited accessibility at the moment, but will open up again soon. NEHGS members, however, can visit our digital archives anytime, free to the public. You can chat with one of our genealogists about your research. You'll see on screen some great educational programs coming up from the Brew Family Learning Center, including a session on managing and understanding inherited items and writing your family history. And for literary sorts, join us for more free author talks in the American Inspiration series. Next Wednesday, January 19, we're hosting two Pulitzer Prize winning historians, Debbie Applegate and moderator John Madison. They'll be discussing Debbie's new book, Madam, the biography of Polly Adler, icon of the jazz age. This is an amazing cultural history that brings to life the Roaring '20s in New York. It's a stunning mix of highs and lows, from patrician politicians to Broadway call girls, famous writers to infamous gangsters. They are all here in this work of nonfiction. Don't miss this expose of the city in its heyday last century. For more glitter and glamour and another immigrant's tale, join us on February 10 for the story of a Hollywood family, the Mankiewiczes. Last century, Herman and Joe were the forces behind such celebrated films as Citizen Kane, the Marx Brothers' Monkey Business, and more. All About Eve, The Philadelphia Story, and the famous flop Cleopatra. The Mankiewicz grandson, Nick Davis, is the author of this family biography. Grandson Ben, the host of Turner Classic Movies, will be our moderator. Don't miss these Today Hollywood men in conversation. And on February 28, we're welcoming the author and quite a famous lawyer, Linda Hirschman, and her new work, The Color of Abolition. This lawyer, who's argued before the Supreme Court 3 times in all courts of appeals across the US. She's a social historian and a best-selling author herself. She's going to discuss the social movement of abolition, the life work of William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Maria Weston Chapman of Boston. She'll be joined by Lamerchi Frazier of the Museum of African American History here in Boston and in Nantucket. Our mission at NEHGS is to inspire, educate, and connect all of you. And we hope you'll come back for more programs. From all of us behind the scenes in Boston and Huntsville, we wish you a safe and a very warm evening. Thank you for joining us. Have a good night.